Now, as you probably already saw in the last video that I posted, John MacArthur and several other pastors in California are refusing to comply with the state's COVID regulations, and they're planning on keeping their churches open. Now, I've already given my thoughts on the California governor's law banning indoor Bible studies in a previous video, but I haven't given my personal thoughts yet specifically on if the church should stay open. And that's practically speaking. I'm not here to give legal advice. You hear that, YouTube? Now make sure you watch this video to the end, especially if you're gonna go ahead and leave me a nasty comment. Because if you leave me a nasty comment, I don't really care, but I probably will cover your objection here by the time I get to the end of the video. So make sure you watch the full video before you give your thoughts down below. So first, let me start off by saying that I do agree with MacArthur that the churches should be allowed to stay open, given that he's correct about the statistics that he gave for the current mortality rate concerning COVID. When it comes to the church, of course we know that the church is the people, not the building, but that doesn't mean that the physical church isn't also important to believers. Now I don't know about you guys, but it just hasn't been the same for me watching online services, and I miss going to the building, and I haven't felt as spiritually healthy as I usually am without the fellowship of other believers. So I'm glad to finally be back in community in person. And this is coming from an introvert, so I know you extroverts have to be suffering. Now I know that I'm not the only one that's been affected by this. According to the recent statistics and polls, it says that only 1/3 of church-going Christians have been watching online services since COVID began, and of those, there's been a steady decline in people who's been attending these church online services. The recent Barna data shows that those who stopped attending church have higher rates of anxiety, a lack of internal peace from God, higher feelings of boredom, and so on. But even worse, polls anticipate that a large number of those people won't be returning back to church once everything goes back to normal. So I don't care whether you believe in Christianity or not, this isn't good news for anyone that lives in our society. Church has provided untold stability for society, and studies show a direct correlation between mental and physical health and believers who attend church regularly. Now I'll do a video on that on some point, but people not going to church isn't a good thing. So I believe that in-person church service is very important and that churches should remain open. But I don't think that that means that churches shouldn't be taking the recommended health precautions. So here's the way I think about it. Even though the survival rates for those that are infected by COVID seem pretty high right now, that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences that can come from a large spread of COVID-19. When large numbers of people get infected at the same time, there's obviously a larger group of people who need medical attention, and then the hospitals can get overwhelmed, just like how we saw in New York. And that leads to a shortage of staff and the necessary supplies to treat people. Not to mention there's also a percentage of people who survive and have lingering effects that haven't went away, and at this point, they don't know if these things will ever go away or if these people will recover, and if they do recover, they don't know about the permanent damage. We've already seen others that have permanent damage from their lungs and other organs. Now, this isn't to scare, but it's just to say that if we love our neighbor, we need to also love them enough to keep them safe. In my mind, even if there wasn't any potential to die from it and it was something like a stomach bug, I think that we should still love our neighbors enough to keep them safe from it, if we can help it, that is. Now, this doesn't mean not getting together. Like I said, I think that we should be going to church, but it does mean taking the precautions necessary in order to protect those who might be worried about contracting it. So with all that being said, my advice would be this. My advice would be for the churches to provide flexibility for their congregants. Last week was my first time back to my in-person church service, and they provided us with a lot of different options. They offered the regular large sanctuary meetings, and they also had smaller rooms with chairs and rows spaced a bit apart from each other so people can watch the service together on a large screen. And they also had an area in the parking lot reserved for people who wanted to drive and park next to each other and listen by radio while also watching it together on a screen from the car. Now, I really appreciated that because it seemed like they respected people enough to allow them to make their own decisions about their safety and decide for themselves the risk that they were willing to expose themselves to. This also made it where the only options weren't go and get sick or stay home and just watch it on your TV, but instead it provides different options for people to have that flexibility so that way people can feel comfortable together in fellowship. By the way, I go to a really small church with limited resources, so I assume that these larger churches probably have other options at their disposal. So by all means, fight to keep your church open. And if you're a church and able to do so, by all means, also take care of your flock. But whatever you decide, just make sure that you use biblical and godly wisdom in doing so. So those are my current thoughts on the situation. Go ahead and leave yours down below. But the next time that someone tells you that you don't need to go to church, what are you going to say?
What do you mean?